Good evening and welcome to Spooky Southcoast. Tim Weisberg here along with science advisor Matt Moniz. And we are here to talk about the paranormal as we are each and every Saturday night. And, I might be a little bit, what's the word, verklempt maybe a little bit tonight? A bit. The smoky smell is coming. We're doing some construction here at WBSM and they're working on some of the offices in the back, kind of expanding. And in some cases contracting, but they're doing some work around here, and so there's a little bit of a smokiness in the air. So if I get teary-eyed, or it's not, I mean, as much as I'm going to enjoy the conversation, the smoky eyes or the teary eyes are probably from the smoke and the residue
and the drywall dust and all of the other
all that stuff. And you know, I asked Stephanie if she was coming in, and she had something else, another event to go to tonight. She had a wedding to attend. So it's better off.
Yeah.
Because if she was in here, she'd be dying.
She'd be hacking and sneezing.
That plant behind you is enough to keep her from being able to function normally in the studio. And so it's even worse if all this extra stuff was in there. But that's not what we're here to talk about. We're here to talk about the paranormal, as we are pretty much each and every Saturday night. There was no show last week because we were at the Braintree Historical Society for a fundraiser. And our friend Jeff Campbell, the Plymouth Ghost Hunter, put this together. He works very closely with the Braintree Historical Society, and he wanted to have some paranormal folks come and lead a ghost hunt. And Stephanie and I got to investigate the Thayer House, which is named after, it was one of the homes that the person lived in, Sylvanus Thayer, who was the founder of West Point, and who I believe Thayer Academy right across the street is named for. But he was definitely active with us that night. We did some Estes Method stuff, and we did some other investigations. So it was really, really interesting. I mean, it's hard because you have a different group coming in every hour and different people and different energies coming in, but it's a place that I definitely want to get back to. Again, as you know, Moniz, if the place is from the 1700s, I'm there.
Yep.
Even 1700s, even older, doesn't matter. I love to go to those places and check them out. So if you want to go find out more about that, just go to BraintreeHistoricalSociety.org, and you can go and take day tours at some of these places and find out a little bit more. But it was a really cool place, really cool vibe, and hopefully we'll be able to do some more stuff with them down the line. Tonight's main topic is going to be vampires. We're going to get into it with our guest, AP Sylvia, who's here with us in the studio, which is always nice to have a guest in the spooky studio. How are you tonight?
I'm well, thanks. How are you?
Doing spectacular. And we're going to talk about the new book, Vampires of Lore, Traits and Modern Misconceptions. So you can pick this up pretty much anywhere books are found, right? They're in the bookstores and on Amazon and all those places, right?
It's going to be it's available at Amazon and other online stores, and we're trying to get it into the brick and mortar stores right now.
Well, there you go. It's a beautiful book. I mean, how much involvement did you have in the design, the physical design of the book?
A little bit, but that was a lot of it just the publisher doing their magic, and I was thrilled with how it came out.
Listen, I don't mean to badmouth Schiffer, but this is the best damn Schiffer book I've ever seen. And I've seen some pretty good stuff from Schiffer, but like this is just, I've had it on my desk for a couple weeks, and everybody that comes into my office looks at it and says, oh, this is a really nice book. And I say, well, if you think it looks nice, wait till you start reading it, and you get some of the information in there. And we'll get into all of that coming up in a little bit. But before we do that, I just want to give everybody a little bit of a heads up, because it's the holidays. Thanksgiving is this week, right? Thanksgiving this week, right?
Yeah, if you want to start it as a Saturday to Saturday, yeah.
No, I mean, Thanksgiving is this week, right? Like Thursday of this week is Thanksgiving. So it's the week where people have some time to like unwind and sit on the couch, and you know, especially people that are like not into leaving the house on Black Friday to go to those crazy sales. They'd rather just stay home and surf the internet and all that stuff. So I've got your Black Friday plans for you already. You're going to spend your whole day watching season 2 of Hellier. This is going to be released at midnight on Friday through Amazon Prime, through Hellier.tv. I think they put it on YouTube. They put it across the board in a lot of different places. So it's not like you have to have a subscription to anything to see Hellier. You just need to at the very least, go to Hellier.tv, Hellier.tv. And if you didn't see season 1, and if you're not familiar, you don't remember us talking about it on the show.
Awesome.
It's our friends Greg and Dana Newkirk, Connor Randall, and Carl Pfeiffer, and Tyler Strand plays a bigger role in this new season, and our friend John Tenney was in it. And so basically what it is Greg and Dana Newkirk, they run the Traveling Museum of the Paranormal and the Occult. They also run the Planet Weird website. They also run the Week in Weird website.
Yeah,
we'll let the lawyers figure that out. But they have all these, different outlets for paranormal research and for paranormal entertainment. And so being who they are, collecting haunted objects, going out and investigating weird stories, they always get strange emails from people. But a few years ago, they got an email from somebody talking to them about, basically telling the story about these goblins in Kentucky in the Mammoth Cave system under the Appalachian Mountains. And they started pursuing the story, but realizing that it connects to a much bigger picture. And so season 1 of Hellier takes them actually to the town of Hellier, Kentucky, and gets them into some of the deeper stuff about this. And when it came out, when I watched it, I was blown away by what I saw, because it really took paranormal research to another level, and to the level that I like to see it, where it's not so much about the flesh and blood, hardcore physical proof of things, and more about some of the weird connections that things have. And you have to keep following those weird connections to get to the ultimate answer. And I thought that season 1 upped the game about what paranormal TV can be. Season 2 just blows all that out of the water. Right from the beginning, you're drawn in with some of these deeper connections. So if you thought that season 1 was weird, it only gets weirder from here. So I've seen half of season 1. That's what they made available to people to pre-screen. The entire season will drop all at the same time on Friday.
Season 2, you mean?
Season 2. So the entire season 2 will drop on Friday at midnight. So you can get in there and you can catch up now. If you haven't seen season 1, or if you want to go back and revisit it, start watching it now. A good way to spend your Thanksgiving. If you're not a football fan, you don't want to watch football games, watch Hellier, and then you'll be ready at midnight when season 2 drops. But I can't really say too much because I don't want to spoil it for people. But for those of you who have been saying, but why? But what else? But where can this go? These are the questions that will be answered with season 2 of Hellier. And Moniz, you've known me for a long time. You know that out of all the weird things that we talk about on this show, one of the things that's always fascinated me is this character of Indrid Cold.
Yes.
Who appears in the Mothman prophecies.
Correct.
And has appeared in other situations and other stories. And also could be a similar character that appears in other things, maybe just under different names. But they get really, really close on the trail of Indrid Cold, at least in what I've seen so far.
Okay.
I don't even know how much further they get in what I haven't seen yet, but it's pretty amazing. It's gonna be a game changer. So that's my little plug for that. And as you know, I don't really go over the top in my effusive praise of some of these paranormal shows.
No.
I generally try to keep my credibility a little bit because, you don't want to go over the top about every single show because not everyone is good. But I'm telling you, this is great. And this is why they do it themselves, because then there's no network breathing down their neck. There's no production company breathing down their neck. They're able to tell the story exactly as it happens, how it happens. And it's better than anything else you've seen on television when it comes to paranormal stories. So when you get into the depths of this, it will change you as a person watching this. It'll change your world view and your world belief. If you buy into everything that's going on, which I've known Greg and Dana for a long, long time. I don't know Connor and I don't know Carl, but my rule of thumb is this. Anybody that is friends with people that I trust, and I know that those people wouldn't associate with people that I can't trust, I can trust them by default. And these people are all in the Tenney circle, and as anybody knows, if Tenney vouches for somebody, I'm all in on them. So
I'm with you on Greg and Dana. When I met them this year, I thought they were straight up honest, hardworking people.
and they want this to be, as pure as it can be. So and what's funny is you think when you watch paranormal TV shows, and AP, I don't know how much of them you actually watch, but when you watch some of these shows, you see people make these leaps in logic where they say, okay, oh, this must be this ghost, or this must be this happening, or this must be Bigfoot out there. There's a lot of leaps in logic that are made in these shows. But when watching Hellier, I find that they're leaping to the same conclusions that I am. And I shouldn't use the term leaping. They're drawing the same conclusions that I am. And I say, like, that's not a stretch. Like, is it a little bit of a different way of thinking? Yes, absolutely. But I can totally get behind that way of thinking. So it's going to kind of expand the way that you think when you watch the show. So I'll be anxiously awaiting it. The best part about it is it's perfectly timed. Midnight on Black Friday, because we're all going to eat a bunch of food. We're all going to fall asleep at like 4 p.m, wake up a couple hours later and have trouble going to sleep. So we can just stay up all night watching Hellier. And if you started at midnight, by the time you get done, everybody will be done with all their Black Friday sales and all that kind of stuff, with all the crowds and all that. And then you can go out and do your shopping and get all the pickings of things that are left over. So, but one thing you don't want to wait on is if you want to pick up this book, Vampires of Lore, Traits and Modern Misconceptions as a Gift, get it right now, because this is an amazing book. And again, our guest tonight is the author of the book, AP Sylvia. He is here with us in the studio. You're actually from this area originally, so
yes, I am.
You're familiar with, the idea of the Southcoast and some of the way that people in this neck of the woods think. Mm-hmm. And it's not the kind of place where you grow up where people are talking about vampires. It's not something that was probably, in your day-to-day conversations here growing up.
No, probably not.
And so it took you having a trip to New York City to actually get into this.
Yes. Well, I'll say I'm
just going to have you talk a little bit closer to the mic.
Closer?
Yeah.
Hello?
You can pull that mic right up to the end of the counter, too, if that's easier.
Let's try that. All right.
Well, that happens, too. We could also pull that one over, too, if that one will reach.
How's this?
That sounds good.
All right. I will say I've always been interested in sort of the supernatural things and the paranormal and that kind of vein. It's funny. I was actually going through some box of some of my childhood things, and I found a book about ghosts. It was real ghosts information and stuff like that that my mom bought me back when I was a little kid, and I loved that book. And it had all kinds of fun facts and things like that. So it's been something I've been interested in for a long time. But what really got me on the vampire track was I was in New York City in Times Square, and I was there with my fiance, my girlfriend then, and we went into the Ripley's Believe It or Not museum there. I don't know if either of you have been to any of the Ripleys.
Yeah,
I haven't been in, but I've read the comic strip forever and seen the TV shows. So
yeah, they have a few different museums throughout the country. They're great. So as we were walking around, and there's all kinds of fun things there, they had a vampire killing kit, supposedly from like the 19th century. And it was filled with all kinds of interesting objects, wooden stakes and a gun and silver bullets and different potions and thing. And I thought it was great. It was such a fascinating piece. And supposedly, according to the card, it was they were manufactured for people to take with them to Eastern Europe to keep them safe from the vampires that inhabited that region. And I just got such a kick out of it. And sometime later, I was thinking back on that experience. I'm like, let me look these up a little bit. What's the story with these things? And as I was searching online, I found that there was actually quite a bit of controversy surrounding them. Some people thought that they were legit. Ripley's obviously that presents them as authentic. Other people, and there's a number of vampire killing kits in existence, and other people have their doubts about them and feel that they are actually of modern construction using vintage pieces that have been assembled into a vampire killing kit. So it got me thinking. And one of the arguments about them was like, well, some of the pieces in this thing, they really reflect modern ideas about vampires and not authentic ones. This is from the movies. These are things that people would know from movies. And I got to kind of wondering, well, what were the original beliefs about vampires? What did people actually believe? And I had seen different documentaries about vampires over the years, and those would sometimes bring up different things where it might kind of contradict what you would expect. So I started digging, and I was like, well, what about all these things? What about blood drinking and fangs and turning into bats and things like that, and silver bullets? And so I couldn't quite find one sort of definitive source that was, here's an explanation about all this and here's where it all comes from. So I started doing research, and I actually wound up writing the book that I wanted to read. And that's where I ended up. So that's kind of the story of where it came from. And it was quite an interesting sort of journey to discover these things and read through the old accounts and things like that.
See, and it's funny because you go to Ripley's and they kind of have an out anyway, because they tell you, believe it or not. Like, you don't have to believe it. But to take that extra step and to start doing your own research, you do find these things happen. I mean, we've seen exorcism kits that have been put on sale on eBay, and everybody has an exorcism kit. I bought this on eBay. It's a vintage exorcism kit from the 1800s. Well, but not really. It might be a leather satchel from the 1800s, but then they filled it with, they didn't have a plastic tube of holy water in 1850. So but to take it that extra step and to actually kind of dig into it, you wouldn't think in just trying to prove the authenticity of the pieces that would be in there. Like, I'm assuming you're just trying to figure out if it's like of the time frame, of the era, of that. Like, you start digging into that and you start finding, well, but they wouldn't even have that belief tied into vampires at that time. I mean, that must have been a kind of a moment of aha for you to say, well, what is it that we would have used at that time? Or because I'm kind of talking all over myself here. This is what happens when you watch 5 straight hours of Hellier. You start getting all these weird thoughts in your head. You have to look at it from what you know. And like you said, you couldn't find anything else that would explain all this stuff. So you're coming into it to what you know. Did you have to wipe all that away and say, I'm just going to assume that everything that I know about vampires is a misconception created by Hollywood?
Yeah, I essentially went through every modern notion about vampires. I said, well, I want to see if I can prove that in the folklore. Everything. I took nothing for granted. I kind of wanted to strip away all of those beliefs. To see, okay, well, what did people really believe? And well, we assume, we think, oh, well, vampires have this particular trait. And I'm going to come out from assumption of, well, did they? Let me see if there's a period source that actually says that. And if I can't find that, well, then where did that come from? And so that's ultimately what I did. So the Vampire Killing Kit kind of, whether it's real or not, they're wonderful pieces. They're great. And I ended up, when I was in Los Angeles, there's another Ripley's in Hollywood, and they have a vampire killing kit there. So I had to go see it.
You also have to wonder, like, how big of a problem were vampires that they had all these vampire killing kits floating around?
Huge problem.
Like,
huge.
Remember the problem we had with them here in New England, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah. We'll certainly get into that. But it's not like it's not like we're being besieged by vampires. Were there, in researching the kit and the things that were put into it, did you read about any kind of like vampire flaps happening, where there would be these large scale concerns about vampires? I mean, generally, as you go through the book, you're talking about things that happened, especially in the folklore aspect of it, things that happened in small villages throughout the course of history. I don't think I've ever heard of, like we have UFO flaps, we have Bigfoot flaps. I don't think I've ever heard of this like large scale vampire infestation for the most part. It's always been these small little, like, kind of one vampire causing something.
Yeah, they're usually kind of isolated incidents that happen here or there. But especially in Europe in the 1700s, it rose to kind of public consciousness. There were newspaper articles written about them, and there was kind of discussions about vampires and these beliefs, and well, what are these things and that kind of thing. So there have been moments where it was very much present in kind of the popular mindset, but actual vampire sieges all over here with lots of different vampires happening all at once. No, not so much. It was kind of certain incidents at certain times.
And I said, before the show started, I said we're going to kind of work from your conclusion in the book kind of backwards a little bit, and not to really give too much away because we want people to read the book, but you come away with the idea that the thoughts that people have about vampires have shifted over time because we have, as a people, have shifted over time. And we see that happen with all of our boogeymen, where, what we think about ghosts in, 1750, nobody was focusing on trying to prove the physical aspects of a ghost. They were just, trying to deal with whether or not there was actually something happening and something there. They weren't out there trying to detect electromagnetic field fluctuations.
No, they're no orb photography or something like that, right?
And so with anything, even with aliens, we've seen the way that aliens have changed over time. We've seen the way that the creatures that we encounter from the cryptid realm have changed over time, and vampires have as well.
Absolutely. I think vampires, they fulfill a sort of psychological need that people have had. In the past, there was fear and uncertainty about what was going on in the world around them. And they needed to kind of explain that and put their fears onto something. And so vampires, in these certain instances, that was the thing. That was something that they could explain, they could rationalize what was going on, and it also gave them a method to deal with that problem. So I think that's what it was doing then. As time has shifted, as the way we live in society has shifted, I'm not necessarily worrying about whether or not there's going to be a snowstorm and how it's going to affect my harvest or something like that. It's sort of changed and mutated in fiction, and now it sort of speaks to us on a different level with some of the popular vampires we have now and kind of the romantic elements of it and that kind of thing. Yeah,
now it seems more like vampires are almost the embodiment of the dark, of the places that we're not supposed to go, of the people that we're not supposed to be. Like, it's not about vampires roaming around in the dark and biting people and drinking their blood. It's about the fact that they can live forever and do what they want.
Sure.
And they can amass great wealth and all these different things.
There's a much more alluring quality to vampires now, right? They're dangerous, they're dark, they're mysterious, but there's an allure there. The vampires from the 1700s were not alluring in any way. They were scary, and they were disturbing, and you didn't want to hang out with them. People were frightened of them. They were literally frightened of vampires. They would literally do things about it. But now it's sort of speaking to us on a different level of, there's this, the darkness, there's a darkness within all of us and that kind of thing. And, the immortality aspects, that's something that we still worry about now. We have science has explained so much. Now, think back to a time when, you were living in a village and suddenly someone who seemed young and they were young and healthy, and suddenly they got sick and died. And then another neighbor gets sick and dies. Then another neighbor is sick, and you're, well, what's going on? You had no explanation for it. You had to put that on something. You had to figure that out. Nowadays, we have the benefit of the scientific knowledge we've amassed in that time, since that time period. So now we know what's going on, and we can, we understand disease, and we can treat things. But we are still mortal, and so that's probably something that speaks to us. Where, what would it be like to be immortal, and we wouldn't have to worry about dying or something like that. But what's the price you pay for that? So
yeah, and that's one thing that has really kind of happened in the last, I don't know, maybe 20, 30 years, is the moral ambiguity of vampires, of what it is that they do what they have to do to stay alive, and is that a fair? Can you live with yourself?
Sure.
If you're going to have to live forever with the things that you need to do to be able to sustain that life.
Yeah, that's always an interesting idea of, for these, these vampires, it's like, well, they have to kill other people in order to survive themselves. And if they, if you don't kill other people, then they're going to wither and die themselves. So that's sort of an interesting sort of moral question that you can kind of play with a little bit with some, modern vampire things.
It makes for a great literary device in
Sure.
in that regard. Now, what would the people think, based on your research and what you've read? I mean, what would people of the 1700s think about people now who are choosing a vampire lifestyle? Who are, some people are actually sanguinists. They actually drink blood. Some people are more energy vampires. But there are people who are actually living their life as vampires now.
Yeah, I think one of the things that, in many ways, the vampire that we know today wouldn't be recognized by a person in the 1700s. They wouldn't know what it was, because we have a lot of discrete imagery surrounding vampires, and the kind of the dark kind of Victorian garb and all these things. They wouldn't understand. They wouldn't understand it. It would just be something that I don't think they would grasp. They'd be, well, what's going on? What's going on with this person? Well, it'd certainly be strange, and just the whole blood drinking thing would be disturbing to them. Though, actually, interestingly, in some folklore, there was belief that the blood of a vampire could actually work as a preventative measure to save you from the attacks of a vampire. So even with the folklore, sometimes there's this interesting kind of shift, turning the tables.
Which is weird, because in some vampire legends, drinking the blood of the vampire turns you into a vampire.
Yeah. So in some
AKA Lost Boys.
I think True Blood had kind of the same idea. Yeah, that it's not.
So it's kind of an interesting catch there, where in some folklore, the blood of the vampire could protect you, but at the same time, you could also be endangered by that of becoming a vampire yourself or something. And it was kind of like a contagious thing, almost. If a vampire fed upon cattle and then you ate the meat from that cattle, then you could become a vampire. And an interesting thing is that you wouldn't become a vampire like immediately. You wouldn't like eat it and then suddenly you're a vampire. You'd become a vampire after you died of whatever it is you ended up dying of.
No, so you could live another 70 years.
You could live for years later, and that happened in an account where they had this vampire problem and they dispatched the vampire, and then some years later they suddenly had another vampire problem, so they believed. And they said, oh, well, it's because this person ate meat that was from cattle that had been fed on by the original vampire. And now that they died, now we've got this whole new vampire problem. And people believed this, and this happened. And like government officials would go out and kind of have to deal with this situation. It wasn't, it was real to them. And they were in graveyards. They were digging people up. They were looking for signs of vampires.
And one of the things that we should note is that in these earlier accounts of vampires, you talked about how it's a vastly different concept. It was a hugely different concept in terms of their physical appearance. We're not talking about somebody walking around, being this beautiful example of humanity. This is even some of the ghoulish apparitions that we see now with vampire stories. Even those weren't really the way they looked back in those days.
No, it's like some of our imagery is sort of this a vampire that's kind of cadaverous, right? Sort of like pale and thin and kind of creepy and all that. Because that's what a dead person looks like, right? So that's kind of what we think. Well, a vampire is a dead person, so they're going to kind of look that way or something. But to the people of the time, if you thought someone was a vampire and you dug them up and you looked at them and they looked kind of all withered and pale and shriveled and decomposing, they'd be like, oh no, that's what they're supposed to look like. This is fine. No, the issues for them is they would open up the coffin of a suspected vampire, and the vampire, to them, if you looked well preserved, if you hadn't decomposed like they thought you should be, that was a sign. Or in some cases, the corpse appeared to have gained weight. They were plump and reddish in the face, and that actually that can happen in the decomposition process. But the people who were looking at that didn't know that, and so they looked at that and they said, "This makes no sense to us. This doesn't make sense. This person's been dead for a couple months. They're gaining weight. they've got blood around their mouths, which is another thing that can happen in decomposition. So to them, those were the signs of a vampire. So that's what a vampire looked like to them. It was someone that was either it was a corpse that was either well preserved and seemed like they were still alive, or was even better than well preserved and looked healthier than they did in life.
Especially if they had died of something, in recent months that they contracted before they passed away. They might look nothing like they looked in regular everyday life because the disease would be wearing away at them. So it'd be a real big 180 from the way they looked when you put them in the ground to the way that they came out.
Yeah, it's there was a lot, there was some misunderstanding back then about kind of what happens after somebody dies. And even today, I think, if you were to tell somebody that, like, oh, like that's what can happen, people might be surprised. Like, oh, really? You kind of just think of someone's, it's kind of sad to think about, but they go in the ground and they sort of just turn into a skeleton. And that's kind of what happens. They kind of wither away and shrivel up and turn into a skeleton, and that's it. But actually, that doesn't necessarily happen depending on the state of the body and how they were when they died. That people can actually, the body can bloat due to the gas buildup and stuff like that. And so it might even surprise people today, and it certainly surprised people a few hundred years ago.
I don't know how much you researched into this, but how much does the modern embalming process change that?
That should change that pretty dramatically, I would think. I haven't talked to any embalmers, but a lot of it, I would think that would probably not necessarily
you get
happen.
rid of some of the possibilities.
Yeah.
You're still going to get they'll still look like the fingernails grew and the hair grew because you're going to.
Oh yeah, it's still going to. I mean, even with embalming, it's still, the body's still going to ultimately decompose. But some of the gas buildup and stuff like that, I'm not sure if that would occur nowadays.
I mean, if it does, don't blame me. That's if I'm gassy in the afterlife, it's only because that's how I was in real life. But that's one of the weird things that I've picked up from reading the book is the way that people, the way that they treated death was a little different then. I think they still have probably the same religious beliefs where they probably believe that, dying was just part of this process of you going on to some sort of an afterlife. But in some of the accounts that you were sharing from these villages in Europe back in those times, it almost seemed like there wasn't the same ceremonial aspects of death that we would have, where it was like, okay, they were pragmatic about it. They died, they put them in the ground, and they just expected them to stay there. There wasn't a lot of, because you talk about them seeing them come back, but nobody's ever like, oh, I'm being visited by this ghost. Everybody's more like, no, I'm being preyed upon by this vampire.
Yeah, well, I think a lot of times in that kind of instance, there was some kind of illness or something going on that needed an explanation, and so then suddenly it became a vampire. It wasn't necessarily, with a ghost, I suppose you think you just see them and that would be it. But this, it was oftentimes accompanied by people getting ill and dying. So there had to be something more physical at play, I think, to their mindset. Something real is causing this. So I think to them it wasn't a spirit. Although I will say that, some of the terminology and how people viewed things is a bit ambiguous at times, and kind of what it meant to be a vampire, and whether it was, they use different words and such. But it was having a corporeal effect on the person. And I think, it was, death would be a pragmatic sort of thing. I suppose depends on the time and the place and sort of the nature of what was going on. I would certainly assume they would have ceremonies, and they would priests were involved sometimes in sort of these exorcism rituals surrounding vampires. There was definitely a spiritual aspect.
It seems weird to say because death happens every day, all the time around us, but maybe death was different then because there were so many ways that you could die, and people weren't really expected to live 100 years, so they could be more accepting of some of the things. Whereas with us, the death of a person, quote unquote before their time, hits us a little bit harder than it might have back then.
Yeah, and I think one of the things that sort of generated the vampire, the kind of the vampire fear, it ultimately stems from a fear of death, that, this person who has died, I don't want to become like them. I don't want to die as well. I don't want them to take me with them. Right? There was a fear of death. And so kind of being around, having this dead person rise up and be around, like they're going to take me with them. I don't want to die too. So I think that it comes from a fear of death and a misunderstanding of the decomposition process and that kind of thing, with a lot of it.
I think coming up in the next hour, we'll get into some of the beliefs that people have about vampires, and we can kind of talk about some of them, give an overview of how much of these are based in mythology and folklore, and how much of these are actually based in Hollywood. And we can also open up the phone lines as well if anybody has any questions, 508-996-0500. But of course, we're going to keep it on topic. We have some calls that we get from time to time that are, out of left field. But tonight we're going to keep it on topic because we have our guest, AP Sylvia, in the studio with us. And we're going to be delving deeper into the vampire story coming up in the next hour. Do you think vampires are going to remain? We talked about this a little bit earlier, but do you think that vampires are going to remain in pop culture? Like, we see cycles come through. Like right now, zombies are popular when people hadn't really been into zombies for the last 20 or 30 years. And vampires, they don't seem to cycle in like that. There seems to always be a vampire story for each generation.
Yeah, I think that vampires, I think they speak to every generation in a different way. And to me, the zombie thing, there's such an overlap between vampires and zombies. And when you look to the folklore, in some ways there's really not a difference. It's, you have this undead body coming to life and hurting people, right? So I think it just kind of depends on what this generation, whatever the culture sort of needs at the time, and sort of how that they're going to reinterpret these myths. So I don't think vampires are necessarily going to go away, but I think they're going to be reinterpreted, and they'll change over time to sort of meet the needs of what society requires.
I think even zombies did that. I mean, zombies pre-Romero were these, creatures of voodoo, and they didn't have to be dead to become a zombie. You just had to be kind of bewitched into that and cursed into it. But like the Romero zombies kind of crossed over some of that vampire stuff. And I think we like our monsters to have similarities. We'll talk about this coming up in the next hour too. But, you mentioned silver bullets for vampires, and it's something that I still remember, the scene. I think it's from Dusk Till Dawn. When they're talking about they're battling all these vampires, and like, well, what about silver bullets? No, that's werewolves. Oh, I think that's vampires too. Well, does anybody have any silver? Then it doesn't matter anyway. So I think like some of these things do cross over. Maybe it's because we just want one cure-all monster killer.
Silver bullets is in the folklore. Silver bullets is probably kind of the way to go if you're looking for the cure-all.
And the best part about it is, even if it's not a zombie or a werewolf or a vampire or any of those things, and it's just a regular person, the silver bullet's going to kill them too.
There you go.
So you really can't lose.
Multi-purpose.
All right, so we're going to take a break coming up here for the news. We'll come back on the other side. We'll talk more about vampires with our guest, AP Sylvia. Again, the book is Vampires of Lore, Traits and Modern Misconceptions. Do you have a website yourself?
I do. I have a website. It's called locationsoflore.com, and I talk about some of the different places I've visited that have different kind of interesting legends or folklore around them, or just kind of mysterious in some way. Are
they local places here, or kind of all over? Or?
Yeah, some of them are local, some of them are other places. But yeah, like the Mercy Brown grave. I have a post in there about that with some pictures and that kind of thing.
So, and as we mentioned at the beginning, you are from this area originally. So later on, we'll talk about some weird stories specifically from our area, and we'll talk about Rhode Island. We'll talk about Mercy Brown.
Sure.
But we'll also talk about some of these historical cases as well. Just a programming note: next week, I don't think there's going to be a live show because I have wrestling. Yeah. It's supposedly the final show ever for House of Bricks, but they are going to have, I think there's another fundraiser that's happening in December. But for those of you who want to come out and support House of Bricks Pro Wrestling, which does a lot of charity work over the last 10 years, they're wrapping up. They're calling it quits. They're just reached the point where they're kind of burnt out. So this is going to be the final a couple of shows here, but tomorrow, next Saturday, I'm sorry, it's called Final Fight. It's happening at the VFW in Fairhaven. There's going to be every championship will be on the line. They'll all be defended, and I don't know what's going to happen to me because his time is running out. As the Thunder from Down Under, Michael Foster, we haven't really had any resolution to our conflict. So as time is running out, I'm a little bit worried that things are going to start to amplify. So I may get my ass kicked next Saturday night, and you don't want to miss that. So coming out to the VFW in Fairhaven to see that. And then there's a lot of stuff that's going on. We have the December for the holiday season. There's a lot of paranormal things happening, so we might have to just do a little recorded show. I'll do a couple of interviews with people. Maybe we can get Greg and Dana to talk a little Hellier. We'll talk about the upcoming Wicked Weekend that's happening, and maybe we'll put a little something out to the podcast feed. But there won't be a live show next Saturday night, so you're not going to miss Spooky Southcoast if you come on out to House of Bricks and hang out with us there. And then coming up in December, there won't be a show the week of that Wicked Weekend, which is the first weekend in December. And then I found out this week on the 14th, I have to travel. So there won't be a show that night either. But we'll see if maybe we can do some recorded stuff so we can still kick it out. All right, we'll take a break. We'll be back with more Spooky Southcoast.
New Bedford's News Talk Station 1420 WBSM New Bedford, streaming worldwide on the WBSM app and on WBSM.com. 1420 WBSM, New Bedford's News Talk Station. Listen to us live anywhere in the world on the WBSM app. Download the WBSM app and listen to us everywhere. New Bedford's most trusted newsroom, 1420 WBSM. The 1420 WBSM app. Download it and you'll use it every day. 1420 WBSM, as crystal clear as FM. Stream us on the WBSM app.
During the Civil War, it was called soldier's heart. After World War II, they called it gross stress reaction. It's been called shell shock, war neurosis, and battle fatigue. Today, we call it post-traumatic stress disorder, and it affects 1 out of every 5 warriors returning from battle in Iraq and Afghanistan. It's not a wound that you can see, though it can have an even more significant impact. Post-traumatic stress disorder can prevent warriors from living a normal life, hurt their relationships, and affect their ability to hold a steady job. The Wounded Warrior Project offers comfort and support for warriors with post-traumatic stress disorder and all other scars of war, whether those scars are visible or hidden. Find out what you can do to help, because for warriors, the greatest casualty is being forgotten. Please visit woundedwarriorproject.org.
WBSM. New Bedford's News Talk Station, 1420 WBSM. Download the WBSM app and listen to us everywhere. New Bedford's most trusted newsroom, 1420 WBSM. New Bedford's 21st Century Newsroom, 1420 WBSM. Now, you don't have to miss your favorite talk show just because the game is on. Listen on the WBSM app, powered by Flagship Insurance.
Oh my God, I can't live without this app.
1420 WBSM.
There are 2 types of journeys in life. There are those we choose to take, and those that life takes us on. From moments we'll never forget to those we must overcome. I'm Tim McGraw. Join American Airlines and Stand Up to Cancer in our efforts to help make every person diagnosed with cancer a long-term survivor. Visit standuptocancer.org/American Airlines to learn more. Stand up with us.
Ladies and gentlemen, we have arrived in Philadelphia. Local time is 3:05 p.m. and the temperature is 67 degrees. At this time, you are now free to use your cellular devices.
You know that feeling when you get to turn your phone on after the plane lands? You can have that feeling every time you drive. Make sure your cell phone is stowed away whenever you are behind the wheel.
Visit StopTextStopWrecks.org, a message brought to you by the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration, Project Yellow Light, and the Ad Council.
St. Jude exceeds any expectation or any dream I could have ever had about a hospital. I was told we wouldn't get a bill. I didn't quite process that. How's this possible? It's possible through all the wonderful people who donate. I don't know if they are aware of what they do, but they're saving children's lives every day.
St. Jude Children's Research Hospital. Finding cures, saving children. Learn more at stjude.org.
As a parent, your life is your child.
With Luke, he's the whole world, you know?
He was diagnosed with acute lymphoblastic leukemia, and it just rips your heart out. You feel completely helpless.
But when you come to St. Jude, that is a whole nother level of care.
You have cutting-edge scientific research here, doctors at the top of their game, and there's nothing but love in everything that they do.
I asked my wife, I was like, what is this going to cost us? And then we did a little bit of research, and then we realized that no family ever receives a bill.
St. Jude covers the cost of everything so that we could focus on our family. St. Jude gave our family the chance to be together. They saved our son's life, and we did not pay a cent. And that wouldn't have been possible without St. Jude.
Finding cures, saving children. Learn more at stjude.org.
WBSM. WBSM. Download the WBSM app and listen to us everywhere. New Bedford's most trusted newsroom, 1420 WBSM. Phil Paleologos, mornings, 1420 WBSM New Bedford. New Bedford's 21st Century Newsroom, 1420 WBSM. New Bedford's #1 for live local talk. Phil, Chris, and Barry. Weekdays on 1420 WBSM. New Bedford's most trusted news source for more than 70 years. We are 1420 WBSM, New Bedford's news talk station. As long as there's New Bedford news to report, as long as there are Southcoast stories to be told, we'll be here. 1420 WBSM, New Bedford's news talk station.
Over-the-counter pain medications can be bought without a prescription and are intended to reduce fever and temporarily relieve minor aches and pains. There are two main types of over-the-counter pain medicines, acetaminophen and NSAIDs. Although both types of pain medications treat the same symptoms, they work in different ways and have different risks and benefits. That's why it's important to always read and follow the drug facts label on your medicine. If you have any questions, ask your healthcare professional or pharmacist.
We are advocates.
We are defenders.
We are champions.
And friends.
We are the Association of Zoos and Aquariums.
230 accredited members employing thousands.
All dedicated to the care and conservation of Earth's precious wildlife.
Sea turtles,
African penguins,
California condors,
cheetahs,
and countless endangered species that are close to extinction.
See for yourself at aza.org/join us.
Or at an AZA accredited zoo and aquarium today.
Taking pain pills that haven't been prescribed to you is dangerous. If you aren't getting them from your doctor or pharmacy, they could be fake. Counterfeit pills are designed to look like legitimate pain medication and may contain lethal doses of fentanyl. I'm Andrew Lelling, the United States Attorney for the District of Massachusetts. Avoid the risk. Please visit the website of the United States Attorney's Office for more information on the dangers of unprescribed opioid use.
Visit justice.gov/USAO-MA/resist the risk.
Did you know federal prison sentences for drug dealing are not based on only one drug deal, but on the amount you deal over time? Whether it's 3 grams here or 15 grams there. If you deal 40 grams or more of fentanyl, you could spend 5 years in federal prison. I'm Andrew Lelling, the United States Attorney for the District of Massachusetts, and your choices matter.
Visit justice.gov/USAO-MA/PR to learn more about the consequences of dealing drugs.
Hi, it's Olivia Munn with my shelter pets, Frankie and Chance. Say hi, guys. When I adopted them, I discovered that they both have incredible personalities. Chance's sole purpose in life is to love and to be loved. Frankie is a little bit of a scoundrel and always entertaining. They're a little bit of a lot of things, but they're all pure love. Adopt pure love at theshelterpetproject.org. Brought to you by the Ad Council, the Humane Society of the United States, and Maddie's Fund.
This is United States Attorney Andrew Lelling. People receiving medical treatment for opioid use disorder are protected by federal disability laws. If you have been turned away from receiving medical care or housing in a recovery home or from other services because you are in treatment for opioid dependence, please contact the U.S. Attorney's Office at 617-275-8756.
Visit justice.gov/USAO-MA/resist the risk.
To some people, the sound of a baby babbling doesn't mean much. But that's not necessarily true. By 6 months, they're combining vowels and consonants. By 9 months, they're trying out different kinds of sounds. And by 12 months, their babbling is beginning to take on some meaning. Especially if there's no babbling at all. Little to no babbling by 12 months or later is just one of the possible signs of autism in children. Early screening and intervention can make a lifetime of difference and unlock a world of possibilities. Take the first step at autismspeaks.org. A public service announcement brought to you by Autism Speaks and the Ad Council.
Bedford's News Talk Station 1420 WBSM New Bedford, streaming worldwide on the WBSM app and on WBSM.com.
Welcome back. Hour number 2 of Spooky Southcoast. Tim Weisberg here, along with the silent assassin Matt Moniz. And our guest in studio tonight is AP Sylvia. He is the author of the new book, Vampires of Lore, Traits and Modern Misconceptions, which I highly recommend picking up. You know, this is a great Christmas gift to give to people. Like, just wrap it up. Don't explain it. Don't say anything. Just give it to somebody. And when they say, wait, why'd you give me a book about vampires? What are you trying to tell me? Let the mystery just keep going.
It's great.
But it's for anybody that is interested in breaking down folklore, which is something that we love to do on this show. We actually have somebody that has been a big part of our show since the very early days, Chris Balzano. And he is somebody who takes legends and lore and really breaks them down and figures out kind of where they come from and what the nuts and bolts of them are. And I ended up dubbing him something that a term that he seems to like. I dubbed him an analytical folklorist. And so you will be the next person that I dub as an analytical folklorist, because that's what you do in this book. You really break down these legends and these stories, and in a way where when you read it, you say, well, I understand where it's coming from, and everything's cited. And everything's well researched. That's got to be the hardest part, is actually finding, these stories and then being able to determine yourself how much you can put stock into the stories that are being reported.
Yes, that was definitely challenging with this. Sort of starting out when I was, trying to research these things and find stuff out. You do an internet search for something, you're going to find different articles and things. But a lot of times, things that were written very recently, they will incorporate, knowingly or not, some of our modern tropes about vampires without even realizing it. That I think that they're doing it. So you need to be very careful when you're reading something and saying, okay, well, because this says this, I know that that's what people believed. So what I did with the book is I tried to go back as far as I could and try to get, pre-20th century sources, as old as as old as I could find, given my resources, and find out, well, what were people saying. And it's interesting because you can see, like, when you read kind of the modern version of the tale, and then you go back and you read an older version, it's, oh Jesus, that there isn't as much in there as I thought, or, well, this mentioned this particular thing, but when I read this older version, that's not in there. So that was something that was definitely challenging for me. And I ended up, there's a full bibliography at the end of the book. I think there's over 90 sources in there. And it was interesting to kind of go through that stuff and find these old accounts and kind of try to get as close as I could to what people actually believed.
And you're able to go back into antiquity with some of these stories, going back pretty far in human history. And it goes to show that the reasons why you were saying before in the first hour that we need vampires, we are no different now as human beings as they were then, in this needing to have, because in the end, you're kind of looking at something like, even though it's negative and it's scary and it's feeding upon the living and all these different things, it's still the possibility that we can live beyond death.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. It's, the people... the people back then, they're not different than we are now. We have the benefit of, scientific knowledge and scientific advancement. So we know things that they didn't have access to. But, you think about it, you're living in this village, and, suddenly, people around you are getting ill, they're dying. And someone, some elder who you trust says, well, if you want to save your loved one who's sick right now, here's what you need to do. You need to go to the graveyard. You need to figure out who, what corpse is causing this problem. And, what are they left to do? It's, they're going to do something to try to save the person they love and to try to save themselves.
And it seems like in a lot of the stories and the examples that you share, it was a last resort kind of thing. People weren't thinking vampire right away in a lot of these cases and immediately exhuming bodies.
No, I mean, it had to get to, and I think it probably had to get to a certain level of panic for people to start going, okay, well, something's wrong here. This doesn't normally happen. Okay, well, one person unfortunately, unexpectedly passed away. Okay, but then another, and then another, and it's like, well, wait a minute, something is wrong. Something is actively causing this, and we need to know what it is. Nowadays, we would know it's some kind of communicable disease, right? Okay, well, those people were around the person who's ill. They caught that disease. Now they're ill. But back then, they wouldn't have understood that. That wouldn't have been something they were thinking about. So they had to go, well, all this started when this first person died. There was something up with that first person who died. We need to take a look at them. They may be the root of this whole problem. And, it gave them a focus for their energies and their fears. And so, sometimes it might have been just a placebo, the problem ran its course, but they felt like they did something. They felt like they took action. It gave them some sense of control over their lives.
And it's interesting because, the same hysteria is what could give way to the Salem witch trials.
Oh, absolutely.
But at least in this case, they were targeting somebody who had already died as opposed to like burning living people at the stake.
Absolutely. The kinds of thinking and hysteria that could have caused the witch panic could also cause the same kind of things, a vampire panic. It's just kind of thankfully with the vampire scenario, the person's already dead. So if you're going to you're going to dig them up and you're going to mutilate the corpse in some way, well, it's sad. It's certainly very sad that would happen. But no living person is being hurt. But with witch trials, that's a whole other thing. Now you've instead of placing the blame on the dead, you've placed the blame on the living. And then obviously, great tragedy has occurred because of that.
We do have a call on the line. Let's just take it and see if it's related to the topic. But just so everybody knows, any phone calls that we do take tonight, we want them to be on topic, discussing vampires with our guest, AP Sylvia. Good evening. You're on Spooky Southcoast.
What's shaking, Playboy?
Hey, Lamone. How's it going?
Just living, loving. How's everybody doing out there?
We're doing well. Do you have a question regarding vampires for our guest?
I got a thing. Yeah, a couple things. Why do women like to be bitten by vampires?
Well, I'm not really sure. I know that can be a motif in pop culture and that kind of thing.
Go ahead.
I
thought it was because any opportunity to lose weight, they take the opportunity to do it. So,
dear.
Come on.
Waka waka. So I like. So you like vampires? Have you ever seen the Carl Kolchak, the Night Stalkers, the original vampire, the biggest vampire? Have you seen that, man?
Oh no, I haven't.
You sound awful young.
Oh, yeah.
He sounds awful young. You sound like maybe 1983. You were born. Am I about right?
Oh, you're not far off.
Okay, well, you go, damn youngling. I hate this what happens. Well, hey, I used to be a youngling, too. But I look kind of, anyways. Like I said, yeah, that's good. So if you ever get a chance to watch, have you seen any Kolchak, the Night Stalker episodes?
I haven't. I've heard of it.
I have.
Well, he's look at this, Tim. You've got so many young, sheltered visitors on your show.
The problem is Netflix had Kolchak for a little while, but before we could start recommending to everybody that they go and watch it, they took it down again. So
it is on YouTube, though.
For free, or do you have to pay for it?
No, I believe it's free.
I do have the DVD, the full series of DVD. If you want me to put it up for people to watch it.
Hey, if you want to host it on your channel, we'll send people to it. But it's a great show.
Don't mind if I do. If you do, then go to my channel and you see I was dressed like Dr. Doom on Halloween, and I was in a bathroom and I was taking a video, and you could see two shadow people, one that's like right behind me over like my right shoulder, and then at the end of the video, it's like 17 seconds. At the end of the video, up in the corner in the ceiling, you can see another shadow person pop up in there.
And that's on your YouTube channel?
Yes. If you go to it right there.
What's your YouTube channel?
Constipated in Sin City.
Okay. So the same as your screen name.
Yes. And so, if you go there, you can see it. It's very clear. It's like people had to look at it. I didn't notice it until after someone pointed it out to me. Say, hey, Lamone, look at that. That's scary. And I was like, oh, boinks.
Oh, we'll definitely we'll check it out.
That would be good. And I think that Stephanie should look at it, too. But she's not there. She's never there.
No, she had a wedding to go to tonight. We're gonna have to move on, Lamone, because we have some other calls lined up here. But thank you for calling.
Are you working? Are you doing Midnight in the Desert this week?
Not that I'm aware of, no. I don't have anything scheduled.
Are you having the show on next Saturday?
Next Saturday we'll be off.
Oh, dang. I wanted to share some. Oh, good.
All right, well, you have a good Thanksgiving. We'll catch up after then.
Okay, old rats.
All
So,
right.
like I said, if you get a chance to go see It's a Beautiful Day in the Neighborhood.
Will do.
That Thursday night.
All right. Thank you, sir.
So it's like, oh, I got some stuff I want to tell you.
All right. We will talk to him. I'm going to have to just let him go because we do have to move on to another call here. Good evening. You're on Spooky South Coast with AP Sylvia. How are you?
Good evening, gentlemen.
Hello.
I have a question, Mr. Sylvia. Is there a given type of situation or circumstance for your research that a vampire may appear?
So, historically, a lot of the folklore was going on when there was some kind of illness that was affecting people, some kind of disease. People were passing away, and some of the people that were getting sick might be claiming, "Oh, well, this person who passed away, I saw them in the night, and they were harming me," essentially. But it could be other things too. There are even some accounts of there was like a drought or something like that, and they would look to a vampire and say, "Oh, the vampire is causing this drought. This dead person is causing this drought." So it really kind of depended on sort of what was going on at the time period that was sort of a cause of fear that people felt that.
So some kind of illness that really has no rhyme or reason.
Something that they thought didn't have rhyme or reason.
Okay.
With modern thinking, we probably could explain it.
And Tim, from what I understand, the Thunder from Down Under, I've been listening in gyms around the area. Guys are getting ready for the big show, and I think he wants to put you to sleep before his match.
He can try it.
All right.
We'll see what happens. All right. Thanks, Phil. Have a good night. And 508-996-0500 if anybody wants to call in with any questions related to vampires tonight. One of the things we were talking about the idea of life after death and the undead. One of the things that you say at the outset of the book is that you're focusing on just stories of these beings that were dead and came back to life. Because if you start getting into some of the things that weren't dead, that were living creatures that are exhibiting signs of vampirism, there's a whole new world of stories there, right, that you would have to start digging into as well.
Yeah, and that's something I kind of lay out at the start of my book is what I'm deeming to be a vampire, and that kind of focuses my research. Sometimes you may find other authors who are writing something about vampires, and they're using a much kind of a broader approach, where you're dealing with things that are sort of supernatural entities, monsters or demons or something like that, and they happen to have maybe they're drinking blood or something like that, but they were never people. They weren't. They're not dead people coming back to life. They're some other sort of non-human entity to begin with, and so those kinds of things I excluded because to me a big part of sort of the vampire folklore is a fear of death and a fear of the dead. So people who they would have rituals and they would have practices that, okay, well, we need to do this to prevent the person from becoming a vampire. We need to do these things to make sure that this corpse doesn't rise up, later on, that kind of thing. So there were different kind of rituals for that. So people, it was a fear, like we need to do this to keep ourselves safe before something bad happens. Let's take some actions. So that's to me was a kind of a big part of what vampires really were. It was a fear of the dead and what they could do to you. So some of these other legends, which are very interesting, very kind of compelling, to me didn't kind of resonate with that. And I fear that when you include too many things, you might kind of lose the picture of what these vampire beliefs were about, in my opinion.
Yeah, I mean, if you're dealing with something that is, say, a demon, for example, well, of course demons can kill you and suck your blood and do all this stuff, but with it being a former person or, still a person, however you want to look at it, a resurrected corpses,
sure.
That, for lack of a better term, humanizes it. That gives it a completely different feel to it and a completely different reason to be afraid.
Absolutely. And because it hits close to home. This was somebody we knew, and now we have reason to fear them, rather than some sort of creature that we read about from mythology or something like that.
And that's key, because the stories, a lot of the stories that you're covering that gave rise to some of these legends, it's not Dracula, where they just were lost in the woods and they encountered some guy in a castle. These were people that they knew either from their own family or from their own village, who were coming to them and acting in a menacing way that was completely unrelated to the way that they would have been when they were alive.
Absolutely. That's kind of one of the pieces of it that to me is kind of is so scary, that this was someone who was a member of the community at one point, and now they have reason to fear them because they've died, because they're now in this state of death. So I think that's kind of a compelling aspect, and I think it's an important aspect when you're trying to sort of piece together what vampire beliefs are all about.
There was one story, I don't know if I remember the exact details, but the vampire in question was actually the victim's father. And he came back and he visited. I mean, you say to yourself, well, why would you let a dead person that you know is dead come into your house? But when it's your own father and you just lost your father, you're going to want to let him back in. It's like seeing Pet Sematary. Why would they let the kid into the house? Because it's their kid still.
Yeah. I mean, that's kind of that's sort of an emotional aspect of it, that this, and I believe I know the story you're referring to, but yeah, he comes in and he sits down to dinner with the family, and there's a soldier there who was in the area, who was a guest, and he's wondering, like, well, why is everyone suddenly acting so strange, and who is this visitor? And it was the father, who had been dead for, I think it was like 30 years or something like that. And so yeah, that's alarming and disturbing, and it's not some unknown monster. You open the door and like, what's this thing? I closed the door, we got to do something. It's like, oh, like this was someone we knew. How that's what's very powerful about that.
And not to kind of jump the gun into some of the tropes about vampires, but one of them is that you have to invite them in for them to be able to come into your home, or to be able to enter into wherever it is that you are. Where does that kind of come about from?
So that's an interesting one that kind of to my thinking sort of evolved over time. There's no sort of folkloric precedent for the vampire needs to be specifically invited in to get in. It's sort of a quirky kind of thing when you think about it, because well, they're not particularly menacing if you have to invite them in, right? So a lot of the folklore that nothing like that comes up. People are dying. Why? Obviously they're not inviting this entity, and everyone's living in fear of this person they think is a vampire. No one's inviting them in. They're coming. The vampire is coming and going as they please. But there are some beliefs where the vampire would kind of would sort of walk through the town, and they would call at the door, and they would call for someone, and it was believed that if the person answered, then they would die. And there was depending on the place, there was a belief, well, they'll never call twice, or they'll never call 3 times at the door. So you have to wait for a person to call more than that number of times, then you knew it was safe to respond. So some people might think like, oh, well, there's the invitation. That's the invitation thing in folklore. But that's kind of getting back to what I was saying earlier, where it's so easy to kind of interject our own thoughts about this into folklore when we read it, because it's not saying that they were asking to be invited in. They were calling for the person, and the person's response was the thing that was going to cause their demise. So it seems similar in a way, but it's not that they were saying, please invite me in, okay, come in. They were calling for someone, you said yes, and then that was the trick. And then otherwise the vampire would simply move on. But there's some literature that started introducing this kind of notion where like there's one fictional story, and it's not folklore, where the vampire they want to feast upon the woman they loved in life. The person died, and he's come back to life, and he wants to feed on her, and he can't enter her house because it's considered like clean and holy, I believe so he has to kind of trick her into leaving her house because she doesn't know he's died, and that kind of thing. So, and then ultimately you kind of get to Stoker, who Bram Stoker from Dracula, who says quite explicitly, oh, he needs to be invited in, that kind of thing. And there's some other stories in there that kind of move the ball forward a bit as well before Stoker. So that one is interesting because it kind of evolved from something in folklore that was in the realm, but not specific. And then a few different fictional stories come out that kind of move in that direction. Then ultimately Stoker, if there was any sort of ambiguity in the other fictional stories, Stoker's like, oh, well, Dracula you have to invite him in.
And what I always thought about the Stoker story that made it interesting that you have to invite them in is you can say in some ways, okay, well, that's a buffer to say, like, if people are afraid of vampires now as a result of this, like, don't worry, as long as you don't invite them in, you're safe. But what I always took away from that concept was by inviting him in, what happened to you was of your own doing.
Yeah, and that's why I think it fits better with literature than folklore, right? I mean, if you just need to invite them in, then why are people taking all these other precautions, with crosses and garlic and stuff like that?
Was the inviting them in almost a euphemism, maybe?
Could be. I mean, I think you can kind of look at it like, you need to sort of invite evil into your life, to kind of go down a dark path or something like that. You sort of choose who you associate with and that sort of thing. So I think you can sort of psychoanalyze Stoker in different ways, and many people have over the years. But I think it puts it on the victim in some way, which is sort of strange.
Yeah, victim blaming.
Yeah.
Somebody just mentioned that.
Yeah. So that's kind of an interesting aspect to it. It's like, well, you shouldn't have invited him in.
Right. Hey, it's your own fault. So what was the most surprising thing to you to find that didn't really have a folkloric background when it comes to the vampire myths that we have now?
Well, there was a lot of different things that were pretty surprising. Some more than others. I guess I would have to say Fangs.
That was the one that stood out to me too.
Yeah, is probably the most surprising thing because it is so iconic with our vampire imagery today. If you were to shoot a movie or something, and you had sort of this menacing character walk by and they smile and they have two long canine teeth, immediately they're a vampire, right? You don't need anything else in that shot to tell you that this person you're seeing on screen is a vampire. And so then when I look back at the folklore, and there wasn't really anything like that specifically, that was really interesting to me.
The thing that blew me away the most is that you said that there's not even a mention of fangs in Stoker and Dracula. You kind of pinned it on maybe the Hammer films as being when the fangs really came into play.
Yeah, well, the fangs the fangs came out of there was a 19th century penny dreadful called Varney the Vampire, and that is the origin from my research of where fangs were introduced. There's there's the main vampire, and it says it in a few different ways, tusk-like teeth and stuff like that, and it also mentions the two pinpricks on the neck. So that penny dreadful is sort of where the fangs kind of came into their own, and nowadays, obviously, I say this in the book, nowadays obviously fangs are that's just what a vampire is, but kind of then reading that must have seemed so fresh and new to the Victorian readers.
I think the film Dracula was at 31 that came out?
I believe so.
So if that's kind of when we start to get this romanticized vampire, but I think maybe the closest that we come to the truth, or at least of mythology, was Nosferatu. Because in that, you're getting somebody who is human, but at the same time, he's clearly a monster.
Yeah, so the Nosferatu is... Yeah, and there's kind of there's this plague of rats that come along with him and that kind of thing. And he is definitely kind of monstrous. So he's a great he's a great kind of example of a vampire that was not sort of the alluring vampire. He was the menacing vampire. And he had these two front fangs. They're kind of like these two rat-like fangs. But there were no fangs in the 1931 Dracula movie is I think what you were referencing earlier. There's no fangs in that
the original
movie.
the Nosferatu.
No, in the in Bela Lugosi. in the Universal Dracula film.
Yeah, well, people are also mentioning that they do believe they mentioned that Bram Stoker did mention marks on the neck.
Yes, no, but that was in the novel.
That was my mistake. I was referring to the movie, and I referred to Stoker's Dracula, but I meant the film.
Okay.
Yeah. So Stoker had fangs in the novel, but the 1931 Bela Lugosi movie, you never see Bela with like the two front, the two front fangs.
Was that Todd Browning that directed that?
I don't recall.
I think it was.
But
James Whale directed Frankenstein. I think Browning directed Dracula. Not that it matters. Just.
But so Nosferatu, he had his fangs were kind of like the two front. They're kind of like two front teeth, two like kind of rat fangs, which are really interesting. But yeah, he's definitely a more menacing vampire.
I just love the story. Like I love all the legends that have been associated around Max Schreck in that movie and everything. And
yeah, it's an interesting. I mean, just the whole kind of how that film, what they were trying to do. They were essentially for those
Klaus, what was his name? Klaus in the movie.
I forget all the names. But I mean, what they were sort of trying to do with Nosferatu is the company Prana Film was they wanted to do a Dracula movie, but they didn't have the rights to Dracula,
Mm-hmm.
so they changed a bunch of names and some of the plot elements, hoping that they could kind of skirt the copyright and release the film, and ultimately that did not fly. And Bram Stoker's widow sued them, and they were actually supposed to destroy I think the judge ruled they were supposed to destroy the film. But some copies remained, and so now we still have it today.
And now it's free on YouTube, so you can watch it if you want.
Yeah, and it's a really interesting film. I have a version of it that has a commentary by Raymond T. McNally, who was kind of a vampire scholar and professor, and he does like an audio commentary of it, and it was really great. And he came out with some great points during it. But it's a very interesting film and very atmospheric.
Oh, absolutely. So some of the other legends or some of the other things that are associated with vampires, you do a deep dive into where they might have come from and where they kind of fall apart and become more of a more modern thing. What's something that besides, fangs, of course, being something that surprised you, but what's something that you found that was more of a modern thing that you don't really find in some of the mythology of vampires? What's a Hollywood creation?
Well, we'll go
besides the fact that they sparkle. Like that's definitely that's a Stephanie Meyer thing.
Well, I would say a Hollywood thing, a thing that was introduced by the movies, actually goes back to Nosferatu, with a vampire being destroyed by sunlight. That was not in the folklore. That wasn't present. There's some different things surrounding sunlight, but that was introduced by that movie. In folklore, there are some accounts where vampires are walking around during the day. They're fine. At best, there are a number of accounts where the vampire would become lifeless at sunrise. They would kind of collapse or whatever. But that didn't kill them. They would rise back up again the next night. That didn't get rid of them. It's funny because we think of like, oh yeah, sunlight kills vampires because they're evil and all that. But when you go back to the mindset of say the 1700s or the 18, whenever, it wasn't. It makes sense that sunlight wouldn't kill them because, well, you think about it. You dig this person up and you see these traits that you think are vampiric, and it's like, okay, well, just leave him in the sun for 10 minutes and that'll solve the problem.
Right. Yeah.
Right. I mean, there's no catharsis there. There's no release. People felt they needed to do something, and I think leaving it in the sun for a little while wasn't going to cut it. But with the movies, you can have the vampire, shrivel up and turn to dust and all that stuff. So you can have a dramatic effect, and there's the defeat of the villain. So it works in movies, but it wouldn't have worked in folklore. It doesn't fit.
It didn't back then in folklore. They would unbury them and put a brick in their mouth or something of that nature.
Yes. So depending on the
region, yeah.
Depending on the place and all that, there was some belief that the vampire's act of chewing in the grave would actually cause illness and death. So they weren't necessarily leaving the grave. They were in the grave and they were chewing. They were like eating their shroud and stuff like that. So in order to stop that from happening, they would dig up the vampire and they would do something to prevent them from chewing. They would put a stone in the mouth or put dirt in the mouth or tie something around the neck so it can swallow or whatever. And so that was in like in Germanic areas. It was the Nachzor was a vampire that was their kind of MO. So, but anyway, getting back to the Nosferatu, the last scene. I hope I'm not spoiling it for anyone, but
the movie's only 100.
Like 100 years old to 100 years to see it. So, but he's the vampire kind of he's leaving and the sun comes in and he kind of dramatically turns and then suddenly he's a puff of smoke. Though interestingly, I talk about this in my book. In the movie, the plot is that there's actually a ritual that takes place to kill the vampire, who's named Count Orlok. And it basically involves someone having to willingly sacrifice themselves to the vampire so that the vampire feeds on that person for the entire night, and then at daybreak the vampire will be destroyed. So depending on how you interpret that, actually the movie could actually be saying, well, it wasn't just the sunlight that killed the vampire, it was the willing victim as part of this ritual to kill Count Orlok. And actually this is something that I mentioned earlier, Raymond McNally talked about. So it actually could be a bit of a misinterpretation of Nosferatu that caused this very well established vampire trait nowadays.
I mean, it's a great plot device though for a vampire movie because if you can just get it through the night, so it kind of constrains everything into a time capsule that they can tell the story into.
Oh, sure. Yeah. It's got to make it through the night and then the dawn comes and then we're safe and all this stuff. And there's wonderful imagery there with the sun coming up and sort of defeating evil, defeating the darkness. So you can see how well it fits into movies.
I referenced before one of my favorite vampire movies, From Dusk Till Dawn. At the end of that movie, they realize if they just start blowing holes, again, spoiler alert, they just start blowing holes into the building, the sunlight's shooting in and destroying these vampires. So, but there's also some things that have become kind of standards for vampires and the way that we tell the story now that do have some actual factual basis in them. And one of the ideas was, putting stakes through the heart or using a stake in some sense. So you talk about in the book how it wasn't always necessarily through the heart because it wasn't always necessarily just about, destroying the body. Sometimes it was about holding the body down.
Sure, yeah, and so that's kind of an interesting aspect to it. We think of I think it was in Dusk Till Dawn where they took like a pencil and stuck it into the heart of the vampire. He's like holding the heart of the vampire, puts a pencil in it.
Yep.
So we kind of nowadays I think we think of the stake as sort of like this wooden stake is like this magical thing. It has a magical effect on the vampire that kills them. But in some beliefs it was really more that it was you were driving a stake through the vampire, through it into the earth, such that it couldn't rise back up again. You were physically holding the corpse down and pinning it.
Pinned down.
It was being pinned down, exactly. So that it was a physical way of stopping the vampire from getting up and walking around. So it had this sort of like had this kind of practical aspect to it. Now, of course, destruction of the heart also comes into play with certain beliefs, and driving the stake through the heart obviously would be destroying it. So there's kind of this sort of twofold thing to it there.
But also you mentioned, you talk about how it's not really a magical thing, it's a practical thing, but yet there was also certain woods that had to be used.
Absolutely. Depending on the place, there was, and that's why folklore is so interesting, because you have this kind of mixing of elements of like, well, there's a practical thing, but then there's also this magical component to it. So yeah, depending on the place, like certain woods were important, depend like aspen wood and that kind of thing. And I often wonder if it's just the wood that was available at the time was the best one. But there's hawthorn was used, and some of it is been tied to like beliefs regarding like that was the wood that was used during the crucifixion or something like that, and that kind of adds a component, a religious component to it.
I was very fascinated too by you had mentioned the I forget where it was exactly, but they would put the stake into the grave. so that the vampire would actually just stake itself when it tried to come out.
Yeah, that was great. I thought it was so practical, and that's probably what I would do if I had been back then. I'd be like,
I don't really want to have to dig 6 feet down.
Yeah, let's just put the stake on the top.
Yeah,
self-impaled.
That'll take care of it. Like that's a lot of work to dig it up. Let's just kind of drive the stake into the ground above the corpse, and then if it tries to get out, problem solved. So.
Yep. That was like, going back to, again, From Dusk Till Dawn. One of the greatest moments in that movie is when he has the jackhammer and he puts the stake into it so that he can just keep staking everybody instead of having, one stake here and one stake there. Yeah, it was genius. And just the time that we have, again, if people want to pick up the book Vampires of Lore, Traits and Modern Misconceptions, you can really get into the deep dive into all of this and find out. And again, it's a beautiful book. It's not just the awesome cover either. The inside of it is incredible, and it's one of the most beautiful books I've ever seen put out by Schiffer. But in the time that we have left, I want to talk a little bit about some of the New England vampires.
Sure.
We've talked a little bit about them here in the past, but I think people remember the Mercy Brown story, but it wasn't the only vampire story here.
No, there were a number of them that happened over the course of time. One that actually I read about on my blog was Sarah Tillinghast. That one was much earlier, but funny enough, it was in the same town in Exeter, and it's kind of like right down the street from Mercy Brown's grave. But again, you have an instance of people are passing away, and they're looking for a rationale for that, and at the time medical science wasn't able to really help with consumption, right? Tuberculosis, and there was not they didn't really have a lot of answers.
Yeah, the only treatment was just to make people comfortable till they died.
Yeah, go to the desert, it's drier there, something like that. People thought that would work. So you get into this situation of the doctors can't help, and then somebody says, this is actually a technique that'll work. There's this, and they didn't use the term vampire, right? But you still have this motif of the dead harming the living, and so you have to sort of put yourself in the mindset of back then. It's like, it's a long shot, but what else do you have to do?
Right. So at least in the case of Mercy Brown, we're talking about exhuming her body, taking her organs, grinding them up right there in the cemetery, turning them into a paste and feeding that to her surviving brother.
To Edwin, yeah.
Yeah, and that just goes to show, like, we're not talking about the 1600s here. We're talking about fairly recent history. What was it, 1892?
Yeah.
So we're talking about the same year that the Lizzie Borden murders happened. Actually, I think it was just a few months before that. Yeah. That was in February of
1892.
I think it was in the winter time, or right after the winter, because
I think Mercy passed away in the winter, and then it happened I think after that.
So we're talking about pretty relatively modern times to say we have to grind up the organs of this person and now feed it to this other person.
Yeah, it's pretty disturbing. And you can only think about sort of the desperation that would have been happening at for those people at that time. But interestingly, in my research, I found the practice of doing that of taking the heart and burning it to ashes and giving it to the victim, that is not unique to New England. That was a practice that was in Romania, and I found a number of instances of that happening where it was done. And in the old stories they're saying, and it worked. Right. Of course, I think when you get a more modern telling that's got a bit more facts around it, it tends to not work. But that's something that I found interesting. That's half a world away, and they were doing the same. That was the same ritual. So that was quite interesting to me, that because it's something that we don't really think of nowadays as being part of vampire. It's not, you don't see that in movies or something like that.
Right, but as you mentioned, even though everybody was kind of thinking vampire and they were going along those lines in their beliefs, people weren't actually saying that it was a vampire.
No. And actually, in my book, in a lot of my accounts, I often give the name of what the name people used for it, because vampire is just one term for something, but there was depending on the place I mentioned earlier, Naxos or in Greece is a Vricolakus. So I try to include that in the book because I find it interesting that the terminology changes from place to place. But ultimately, again, it all stems from a fear that the dead are harming the living. So something tangibly needs to be done with the dead to save the living.
We have a few minutes left. In all the stories that you researched and the things that you looked up, was there a favorite story that stood out? Was there one that you said, this is one that I've never heard before, but it's pretty memorable? Was there anything like that in your research?
It's all the stories are interesting. Some are more detailed than others. I think the account of Peter Plagojewicz was interesting to me. He, it's one I use one of that stories throughout some of the early chapters of the book because it's very well contained and very well documented. The people of this town are people are passing away and they're thinking it's this person, and so they actually go to this government official, and they're like, well, we need to exhume this person, and we think they're a vampire, and the government official's like, well, slow down there, but he ultimately he and some other folks go because the people are just so up in arms about it, and it's they record the findings and the kind of the what they see and sort of the shock around it all, and then it ultimately gets published. His report gets published in a newspaper, and it kind of brings it to a wider audience. So that's one I like just because it's sort of nicely self-contained, and it's a really interesting account.
But it also shares that story out so that it helps it to become part of the legend in other places.
Absolutely.
Well, again, the book, Vampires of Lore, Traits and Modern Misconceptions, you have to pick it up for yourself because otherwise how are you going to learn about the truth behind ideas such as silver bullets, silver in general, blood-sucking, cutting off the heads of vampires, which I still think, no matter what it is that you're dealing with, if you can cut off its head, you're usually doing okay.
Unless it's a Hydra.
Yeah, not always does it work.
One exception there.
But generally, if you're really scared of something, just cut off its head. Not that I'm advocating anybody goes out and does that, but and you can pick up all of these. You can read about all these when you pick up the book. Again, you can get it from your website.
So if you go, my website's locationsoflore.com, and I have a page about the book. You can buy the book on Amazon, barnesandnoble.com, target.com, a number of other online sellers. And we're trying to get into some brick and mortar stores. So I don't know if there's a local bookstore you go to and you think they should stock it, maybe let them know.
Oh, well, they've already made a sale here. We've got one of our chat people that has just ordered it online on Amazon.
Oh, wonderful. Thank you so much.
And I'm talking to the Sea Witch. I'm talking to Barnes & Noble in Dartmouth. All these local booksellers out there. Reach out to Schiffer, say that you want to carry this book, and we'll bring AP down here for some book signings, too.
Oh, that'd be wonderful.
And bring you back to the area. See, people think they can escape the South Coast. You can never escape. We bring you back. So now the question becomes, what happens when people start reaching out to you now? And they can do so via Twitter. You're on Twitter as well.
Yeah, I'm on Twitter at AP Sylvia Writes. And locationsoflore.com, I've got links to my Twitter and Instagram, and you can contact me there.
People start reaching out to you with stories about current modern vampires. Are you going to go boots on the ground and actually investigate some of these cases, or do you want to just stick to the legend and lore?
If there's something interesting going on, maybe I'll take a look. Who knows?
Have you been to Mercy Brown's grave?
Oh yeah.
Okay.
I one of my blog posts is about that. I took some pictures. Her grave, Sarah Tillinghast. I've been to some other vampire sites around. Actually, there was a vampire hunt in the Chicago Park at one point, so I went there and checked that out as well.
Okay.
All right, so
the Barnabas Collins, the infamous Barnabas Collins?
That's from Dark Shadows.
Dark Shadows. Yeah. Well, the person that got the name got it from an actual grave in Westport, Massachusetts.
Oh my goodness. Oh, that's interesting.
All right. Well, on that note, we will wrap things up for tonight. Again, you can go to legendsoflore.com if you want to find out more about
Locationsoflore.com.
Sorry, Locations of Lore.
Locationsoflore.com.
And you can pick up the book there. And we will be back not next week. Maybe there'll be an episode released to the podcast feed, which is pretty much all up to date now. But we will be off the air for a House of Bricks event, but we'll be back the week after that. So until then, for Matt, for Stephanie, for AP, I'm Tim. Stay spooktacular.
News, talk, station 1420 WBSM New Bedford, streaming worldwide on the WBSM app and on WBSM.com.